Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong, and this is a lecture for patrons. The History of the United States in 100 Objects, number 24, Beaver Fur Stovepipe Hat. So it's been a while since I've posted on this podcast. I have been visiting friends and family, but I am still planning to make more lectures on topics I mentioned before, including another on Korea and also on Italy. And I've also started working on the next video on Red, White, and Royal Blue, specifically on the politics of the movie. So as always, there are a lot of irons in the fire. But since it has been some time, I want to continue my series on the history of the United States in 100 Objects. This one is a large beaver felt hat in stovepipe form with a flat-topped crown, about 6 3/4 inches high, with a wide brim about 14 inches in diameter, made out of a single piece of beaver fur felt about 1/8 of an inch thick. The hat is dyed all black and is very smooth, except running around the base of the crown, there is the visible imprint of the packing threads used in shaping the hat. These imprints are light brown in color since the cords blocked the black pigments when the hat was originally dyed. They also have the surviving imprint of the initials FM, presumably those of the hat maker, and all of these would have been covered up by a decorative hatband or ribbon when the hat was worn. The hat today is in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England. Its exact origin is unknown, but according to the museum's records, it was donated by a person named Lady Spickernell in 1938. And at that time it was given to the museum as part of a collection of men's clothing and hats from Lady Spickernell's maternal family, namely the Cottons of Etwall Hall, Derbyshire. The curators of the museum estimate that the hat was made circa 1590 to 1670, during the high fashion for beaver hats. So you may notice this is the first object that I have discussed in this entire series that was neither made nor discovered in the United States. And arguably, it is also the first one that is not currently housed in the United States, depending on how you categorize the French bronze cannon, which currently rests on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean near Florida. But I chose this hat because the raw materials from which it was made almost surely did come from North America, and that is very important. This hat and its survival in the museum collection is a reflection of the enormous power of the fur trade, which drove exploration, colonization, power politics, and warfare all across the North American continent, and that was critical in the creation of American civilization, and also more specifically of Canada. Its existence today in the V&A is an index of the value and importance of furs and of the hats that were made out of them. Extremely few items of antique clothing from before the time of mass production survive anywhere in the world, and as far as I can find, none at all from colonial America, unless I'm missing something. Yet nonetheless, the Victoria and Albert has several surviving beaver felt hats from the 16 and 1700s, which were extremely durable, valuable, and sometimes passed on and preserved in families and by collectors long after they had gone out of fashion. And this particular hat is especially old, probably dating to the early to mid 1600s. Hence, this episode is a step back chronologically in my series. I have gotten up already to the 1770s, just before the Revolution, like when I talked about the Truro Synagogue Torah finials. Yet nonetheless, I will discuss it here as illustrating the importance of the fur trade, which would continue to be a major force driving colonization and warfare in America, right from the earliest colonial ventures up through the 17th and 18th centuries. So what was the big deal about hats? Well, beaver hats were a major high-value commodity which fueled trade, war, and political contestation on both sides of the Atlantic. Beaver hats were arguably the first manufactured good to create enough demand for raw materials to lead to inter-imperial wars. Hats had long been taken as a foremost symbol of status, as is common in many societies around the world. They signal rank and wealth. They add to the height and literal stature of the person who wears them. They are important to both men and women, although in some countries they are especially associated with men and masculinity. For instance, in Dutch, the word hat is a metonym for a man. They're used also as social tools. Wearing one, removing it, doffing it, tipping it are all signs of different modes of deference. In England, commoners, even including members of the House of Commons, were expected to remove hats in the presence of lords. And Quakers protested against social hierarchy by refusing to doff their hats to titled nobles and other superiors, and so were often punished with beatings, including, at least in one case, to death. In the late Middle Ages, hats in Europe were mostly simple wool caps with brims, often called Monmouth caps. They could be dyed black or red. They were fairly coarse, and wealthier men often covered their caps with coverlets of silk or velvet. The fashion for felt hats made from finer furs began, it seems, in the 1300s. The first known mention in writing is in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where the merchant is said to have a Flemish beaver hat, and this seems to be part of his pretentious extravagance. But then these hats became gradually more common and widespread, especially in England through the 1400s. There was a growing demand for larger, finely shaped hats made from beaver felt, and this was seen earliest among the aristocracy and royals. And then it spread from England all through Western Europe, especially into France. And beaver felt hats can be seen in the portraits of kings, such as Henry IV of France and James I of England, and then also of proto-celebrities like Pocahontas. How were these hats made? Well, they were manufactured mainly by French felt makers and hatters, but also some in England and the Netherlands as well. And it involved more or less 5 steps. Firstly, acquiring beaver pelts. Secondly, tanning the skins to preserve them and allow them to be transported. Thirdly, separating the outer and inner layers of fur. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, the different kinds of fur that attach to a beaver pelt. Fourthly, processing the inner fur into felt. And fifthly, steaming and pressing the felt into hat forms. So as for the beaver fur, as I said, it has 2 layers. For one, there is the longer, coarser outer hair, often called the guard hairs, which serve to keep the animal warm, and which grow very long in winter and then often fall out in the summer. Then beneath the guard hairs, there is a denser layer of shorter, finer fur called wool, duvet, or simply underfur, which mainly serves to keep water out and off of the animal's skin. And this underfur has natural tiny barbs, which make it very cohesive, and also it is naturally shiny and plush. Felt was made from this underfur, but in order to do so, it had to be separated out from the guard hairs. And this was done by various means, sometimes simply plucking out the guard hairs bit by bit, and then shaving off the underfur that is left on the pelt, or sometimes shaving everything off and then sifting meticulously through the hairs by size and color. Once the underfur is separated out, it would then be wetted, agitated in a chemical soup, and the recipe for these chemical soups changed through the years, and then pressed and rolled, causing it to tangle and shrink to make a felt cloth. It was then molded around hat forms, pressed and creased with irons to shape it into hats, dyed, brushed, and trimmed to make a finished glossy hat. And it seems that about 2 to 3 beaver hides would be needed to make one sizable beaver hat. So what was so great about this beaver felt? Well, it offered a number of technical benefits. It was very waterproof. It could hold rich colors and a shine. It was durable. Hats could last for decades, especially if kept in leather cases or sleeves when not being worn. It could take on greater height, emphasizing status, and it could hold complex sculptural shapes. They could be shorter or taller, with wider or narrower brims, and with different crown shapes, including a domed peak called the sugarloaf form, flat-topped called stovepipe, like the hat we're talking about, or with a pointed peak called a steeple. So these beaver hats were highly valuable. They were often bequeathed in wills as valued possessions to heirs. After 1600, the fashion also began to trickle down from the aristocracy into the more affluent middle classes in cities, such as in England and especially in the Netherlands. They became basically de rigueur at all sorts of social occasions. The famous English diarist Samuel Pepys purchased a beaver hat in 1661, of which he was extremely proud. He described going to church with his beaver hat, quote, "which is altogether very noble." He also recorded that the Lord Mayor had invited him to a feast and said that, quote, "with my beaver I was ready to go to the Lord Mayor's." And beaver even just became a simple metonym for these hats. They tended to cost about £3 to £4 each, making them really out of reach for the poor through most of the 1600s, and a fairly large purchase even for the wealthy. For Samuel Pepys, it seems that his hat cost about 1% of his yearly income. Puritans often attacked the fashion for fine hats as a sinful extravagance, and a great example is in a pamphlet by the early Puritan writer Philip Stubbs, who wrote a pamphlet called Hats of Sundry Fashions, in which he writes, quote, "Sometimes they use them sharp on the crown, peaking up like the spire or shaft of a steeple, standing some more, some less, as please the fantasies of their inconstant minds. Other some be flat and broad on the crown, like the battlements of a house. Another sort have round crowns, sometimes with one kind of band, sometimes with another, now black, now white, now russet, now red, now green, now yellow, now this, now that, never content with one color or fashion 2 days to an end. And thus in vanity they spend the Lord's treasure, consuming their golden years and silver days in wickedness and sin. And as the fashions be rare and strange, so is the stuff whereof their hats be made diverse also. For some are silk, some of velvet, some of taffeta, some of scarcinet, some of wool, and which is more curious, some of a certain kind of fine hair. These they call beaver hats, 40 or 50 shillings price, fetched from beyond the seas, from whence a great sort of other vanities do come besides. And so common a thing it is that every servingman, countryman, and other, even all indifferently, do wear of these hats. For he is of no account or estimation amongst men if he have not a velvet or taffeta hat, and that must be picked and cunningly carved of the best fashion. And good profitable hats be these, for the longer you wear them, the fewer holes they have. Besides this, or later, there is a new fashion of wearing the hats sprung up among them, which they father upon a Frenchman, namely, to wear them with bands. But how unseemly a fashion that is, let the wise judge. And another sort, as fantastical as the rest, are content with no kind of hat without a great bunch of feathers or divers and sundry colors peaking on top of their heads, not unlike, I dare say, coxcombs, but as sterns of pride and ensigns of vanity. And yet notwithstanding these fluttering sallies and feathered flags of defiance of virtue, for so they be, are so advanced that every child hath them in his hat or cap. Many get good living of dyeing and selling of them, and not a few prove themselves more than fools in wearing of them." End quote. So you can see tremendous social and ideological meaning, moral meaning, could be invested into the wearing of a hat, the form, and especially the material of a person's hat. And when Stubbs was writing, the beaver hat was still quite rarefied, right? The more affordable hats were in other materials. But nonetheless, the fashion spread to more classes through the 16 and 1700s, especially as it was adopted by the growing mercantile and professional bourgeoisie in the cities. They used it as a sign of high taste and respectability. And by the 1700s, it even began to reach servants who wanted to show their high fashion when doing things like driving carriages for the rich. And over time, styles began to diverge based on different class and political leanings. So upper-class cavaliers in England who tended to be more royalist and adhere to the High Church of England. They adopted more jaunty styles of dress, emphasizing motion and gracefulness. Their hats were highly shaped, with low crowns and very broad brims, often with curving or swooping brims, which, if they curved downward on the sides, were called cocked brims. And these could show off their sense of balance and grace, and also the strength of the felt that could hold that sculptural shape. Meanwhile, for the new middle classes, especially Puritans, the hats were often made in simpler, more symmetrical and sober forms, in simple black or gray colors. They tended to be sturdy, with high crowns and narrow brims, since these were seen as more durable and practical. In the late 1600s, peaked so-called steeple hats were most common, especially for women, in a form much like what we would now think of as the stereotypical witch's hat. And it seems that this image associated with the witch was already in place by the end of the 19th century. Now, why this came about is uncertain, but the American historian Alice Morse Earle argued in the 19th century that the association of the steeple hat with the witch came about because these were in fashion in the 1690s during the Salem witch trials, and so they were seen in early depictions of the Salem witch trials. I don't know if that may be true. I haven't been able to verify that myself. But by the 1700s, beaver hats were fairly widely available and within reach even for some working men, especially, as I mentioned, servants who would be seen in public. So why and how did the price come down from the 1500s to the 1700s? Well, this was partly because of new, more efficient felting techniques, where it became possible to use cheaper furs like rabbits and hares and blend them in with the beaver fur in the making of the felt. But the main reason why they came down in price was because of new sources. So here we have to look at where were these beaver felts coming from. Well, it seems that originally in the late Middle Ages, the beaver pelts came from the British Isles, from Britain and Ireland. But these fairly quickly went extinct. The population wasn't very large, and with this enormous demand and consumption, they went extinct by the late 1500s. After about 1530 or so, the main source then shifted to Russia. So there had long been trading links between northeastern England especially and Russia. And merchants in the English Northeast began obtaining pelts from beavers trapped in the forests of northern Russia and far northeastern Scandinavia. And some of these were of very good quality. So by this time, the dealers began to distinguish between different kinds of beaver pelts. For one thing, those from farther north were more valued because they had thicker, richer fur. Secondly, coat pelts, meaning those that had already been worn for some time as coats or mantles or stoles, these were more highly valued because over time the outer guard hairs will have already fallen out, leaving the soft underfur exposed and easy to harvest. Additionally, the years of handling and use have worked the oils and fats from human skin into the underfur, thus making it even more thick, lustrous, and waterproof. And there were plenty of these available from Russia, since Russian people routinely wore furs, both for decoration on their clothing and for warmth. So hence there was a win-win here, right? As Russian merchants could easily and cheaply collect old, worn-out furs, they could then sell them at especially high prices to these English buyers. So this was a mutually beneficial trade, but also some problems arose. For one thing, the transport was not at all easy. At this time, Russia still had no Baltic port, and so exports from Russia had to be transported by an Arctic route, leaving from the port of Arkhangelsk on the White Sea up to the Arctic Ocean, around the northern coast of Scandinavia, then down to the North Sea and Britain. And this kind of shipping was difficult, expensive, and erratic. It could only be conducted at times when the sea ice on the Norwegian coast was clear, which was only part of the year. And so transport was always expensive, and then prices went up even further over the course of the 1500s, as the coat pelts in Russia began to run out, and Russian suppliers could only offer newly tanned pelts from newly trapped beavers, which were usable, but again, not as valuable. Also, the wild beavers in Russia began to be overhunted and dwindle to near extinction, just as they had in Britain. So it might have seemed by about 1570 or 80 or so that this trade also was going to die out and beaver pelts would become a thing of the past, until a solution appeared from an unexpected place, namely the Americas. So starting in the late 1500s, some European fishermen, especially Basques from the coast near the French-Spanish border, these Basque fishermen made frequent voyages to the coast of North America, especially to the so-called Grand Banks, the shallow coastal waters near the shores of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, rich in ocean fish, especially cod. And these Basque fishermen developed ways to salt and preserve cod so that they could gather large cargoes of it and ship it all the way back to Europe. Hence, they began to set up temporary encampments on the shores, especially on Newfoundland, and they started to trade with local people for other supplies, such as animal pelts, for coats, blankets, and shelters. They would then sail back to ports in Europe, mainly in France, in order to sell their fish. But by the late 1500s, as beaver pelts became highly expensive and valued, French traders in these ports began to notice that these fishermen had nice, lush, warm, and oily beaver pelts, and they started to simply buy them off these fishermen directly for good money. After about 1590, some of these fishermen then began to transition from gathering mainly fish to instead gathering pelts, by trapping or more so by trade with indigenous people. Then French merchants began sending adventurers to sail to North America, land and trade for goods with the native people, especially for beaver furs. The French crown recognized the strategic importance and usefulness of this trade, but they did not have enough capital or credit to create permanent trading colonies. So instead, in 1599, King Henry IV granted a monopoly over the trade in furs to two French merchants, and this then made it profitable enough for them to create permanent trading outposts themselves using private capital and investments. In 1600, they founded the trading outpost of Tadoussac near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, which was a convenient location for gathering furs. The problem was that this was very remote and isolated, and it was difficult to defend and supply this trading outpost directly from France. Hence, the French colonies of Port Royal, founded in 1605 on the Atlantic coast, and then Quebec, founded further up the St. Lawrence River in 1608, these were created in large part as way stations to supply and protect fur trading posts like Tadoussac. That was their main raison d'etre. So the French were the first out of the gate and the most aggressive in trying to corner the trade in beaver furs from America. But they were pretty quickly followed by English and Dutch missions, and this soon led to a three-way inter-imperial competition among French, Dutch, and English traders and colonizers, all of whom wanted to gain the most direct access to the best furs. So if we look at the English, their early colonization was aimed more at creating agrarian settlements, and their colonization undertakings were very haphazard, often launched by private groups with some sort of royal backing. But the colonies in New England did get involved in fur trading as well, thus threatening the French monopoly. In 1621, the very first ship to return from the Plymouth colony back to England carried back 2 hogsheads, or large barrels, of beaver furs. By 1634, the Plymouth colony was sending 20 hogsheads a year of beaver furs back to England. But they saw a quick depletion. As early as 1645, the beaver trade on the New England coast was exhausted, and now the traffic in beaver furs was running largely through the frontier settlement of Springfield on the Connecticut River, far to the west. Evidently, some hat makers did begin making felt hats for a local market within the colonies, but it was never as important there as fishing or agriculture, which the state supported and encouraged much more. In 1672, it seems that hat makers in Massachusetts banded together into an association and asked the colonial government for protection and support for American hat manufacturing, but they were refused until they could start making better hats. And probably even at this time, they were not working mainly with beaver fur, but rather with raccoon furs. After about 1650, New Englanders sold most of their beaver pelts to the Dutch, who had trading posts at Narragansett Bay in what's now Rhode Island and Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts, and who could offer better prices. By the mid-1650s, it seems that the Dutch were obtaining over 15,000 pelts a year from New England. So how did the Dutch become involved in this trade? Well, they came very quickly on the heels of the English. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established Fort Orange up the Hudson River at the head of navigation of the Hudson, and it was clearly intended as a hub for the fur trade from the interior of the continent. And the fort was informally called the Fyke, or trap net, for, you could say metaphorically, trapping the trade in one place. The trade was formally controlled by the Dutch West India Company, which had a state monopoly, and in its first season, it seems 1,500 beaver and otter skins were sent back to the Netherlands. The trade grew steadily and attracted many merchants who made significant fortunes. One of them, Adrian van der Donck, lived and worked at Fort Orange between the years 1641 and 46, and van der Donck gave the first sort of detailed written description of what was important about beaver pelts. And he wrote, quote, "The beaver's skin is rough, but thickly set with fine fur of an ash-gray color, inclining to blue. The outward points also incline to a russet or brown color. From the fur of the beaver, the best hats are made that are worn. They are called beavers or castoreums, from the material of which they are made, and they are known by this name all over Europe. Outside of the coat of fur, many shining hairs appear, called wind hairs, which are more properly winter hairs, for they fall out in summer and appear again in winter. The outer coat is of a chestnut brown color. The browner the color, the better is the fur." And van der Donck goes on to explain how by this point so many pelts were coming from America into Western Europe that the Western Europeans began to have an oversupply, which they could then lend or sell to dealers in Russia. So now the trade has sort of reversed direction, and this excess is going to Russia, creating a sort of peculiar reciprocal trade, where the Dutch especially supplied new pelts to Russians who made them into garments, which then, after they were worn out, they were then sold back to the Dutch. So Russia was almost like a fur-wearing factory. And van der Donck writes, quote, "When hats are made of the fur, the rough hairs are pulled out, for they are useless. The skins are usually first sent to Russia, where they are highly valued for their outside shining hair, and on this their greatest recommendation depends with the Russians. The skins are used there for mantle linings, and are also cut into strips for borders, as we cut rabbit skins. Whoever has there the most and costliest fur trimmings is deemed a person of very high rank, as with us gold and silver embroideries are regarded as the appendages of the great." So you can see here an interesting irony where the fur itself, the pelts, are signs of status in Russia, whereas this manufactured product in the form of felt is what gives status and prestige in the Netherlands. And he goes on, "After the hairs have fallen out or are worn, the peltries become old and dirty and apparently useless. We get the article back and convert the fur into hats, before which it cannot be well used for this purpose, for unless the beaver has been worn and is greasy and dirty, it will not felt properly. Hence these old peltries are the most valuable. The coats which the Indians make of beaver skins, and which they have worn for a long time around their bodies until the skins have become foul with perspiration and grease, are afterwards used by the hatters, and make the best hats." End quote. So there's this key fact here that van der Donck is also noting, that you can skip that step. You don't have to go through this Russian market if you can get coats and garments from the Indians in America, which have already been worn in this way. So by this time, by the middle of the 1600s, the trade is highly lucrative and is making enormous amounts of money for West India Company merchants. And not surprisingly, the West India Company could not realistically control the trade entirely. Their monopoly was basically unenforceable. Many private citizens, including just small farmers and settlers in the New Netherlands, illegally traded with Indians and smuggled pelts, including some so-called bush runners who basically went out into the forests, tried to intercept Indian traders before they reached the fort, and also simply colonial householders, especially women, who would invite Indians into their homes, often ply them with alcohol, and trade home items such as knives, shears, or other tools, beads, and rum for worn beaver pelts. The colony passed a series of laws banning colonists from even speaking with the Indians about trading. The fortress at Fort Orange was enlarged with barracks to house the Indian visitors and open fields in which all negotiation would supposedly take place out in public view. But nonetheless, some illicit trading still continued. The trade reached its height in the mid-1650s. In 1657, almost 41,000 beaver hides were sent from Fort Orange. But it was already starting to diminish by 1660. And then after the English took over the New Netherlands in the 1660s, the trade continued on but vastly diminished, such that only about 9,000 pelts were exported from Fort Orange, now called Albany, as of 1687. So why did the trade diminish in the Hudson Valley? Well, for one thing, the stocks, again, were dying out. The beaver was almost completely extinct in and around the Hudson Valley, and hides had to be obtained from farther and farther north. But suppliers in these farther hinterlands to the north and the west were increasingly lured away by the French. So in the later 1600s, the French really began to reassert themselves and regain primacy in the fur trade. So the French government poured resources into extending the trade further into the continent. Explorers were dispatched westward, up through and around the Great Lakes, and south into the Mississippi Basin. They also went furthest in establishing close diplomatic ties with Indian tribes and nations. They put more effort than the English or the Dutch did into converting Indians to the Christian religion, and also sometimes encouraged intermarriage between French frontiersmen and native women. They set up a series of important fortresses at critical juncture points to control the trade far into the interior. These included Fort Niagara, where Lake Ontario empties into the St. Lawrence River, at Detroit, on the river connecting Lake Huron to Lake Erie, and at Michilimackinac, the straits connecting Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. Also, other small missions and outposts were set up on Lake Superior, far to the west. And the French established certain continuing practices. Some pelts were brought by Indian traders to forts, like one saw at Fort Orange in New Netherlands. But also thousands of others were obtained by traders that fanned out into the forests and the inland waterways. Some of these were licensed so-called voyageurs, who were commissioned and given licenses by the fur trading companies. Others were technically illegal, so-called coureurs des bois, or runners of the woods, who set out without licenses and often went further to find supplies and could trade metal tools, vessels, alcohol, firearms, etc. for pelts, and most especially for the good, well-worn coat pelts, which were the most highly valued, as we've seen, and which adventurers really had to race to obtain first by making earlier contact with far-flung tribes and nations. Now, what about the Indians themselves? What role did they play, and how did they respond to all this? Well, many Indian nations saw an enormous military and economic advantage in trading with the French. And they sometimes also competed with one another. Much as these European empires were competing for access to the supplies, Indian nations often competed with each other for access to these European markets, and especially for more direct access to the French outposts, which were the most convenient and offered the best prices. Sometimes larger, more powerful states, such as the Iroquois and the Wendat, sought to interpose themselves and to act as the sole middlemen between the European buyers and other smaller Indian states that had beaver supplies. And this competition between large indigenous states fueled a series of wars all through the mid and late 1600s, which were very bloody and were intensified by the new proliferation of firearms. The Iroquois, or Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, at first took the upper hand, and they attacked and basically destroyed their main rival, the Wendat, also called the Hurons, and then they conquered southward through the Ohio Basin, thus effectively taking control of almost all of the trade with the French and English. But as supplies in this area, in the Ohio Valley and the lower Great Lakes, as the supplies of beaver pelts were depleted and European traders ventured further into the continent, especially to Lake Superior, contact then was made with other indigenous nations, especially the Ojibwe, who then became the major middlemen in the 1700s. Now, tribes in this area, the Ojibwe and others around Lake Superior and northward and westward, took up a common practice of encouraging French traders to marry local women. This would create a permanent diplomatic tie between their own tribe or nation and the French. It would help to ensure that the French traders would buy from that tribe into which they had married and sometimes even been adopted, and not trade with nearby rivals. So it was a way of sort of directing and managing the trade. These women who married French coureurs de bois or voyageurs then served as crucial dealers and intermediaries. And the children of these unions, whom the French called métis, simply meaning mixed, these métis then largely took over management of the trade in the 1700s as this new generation came of age. Now, meanwhile, as we said, the French kept trying to limit the trade to licensed voyageurs and to cut out or crack down on these illegal coureurs de bois. But this was extremely difficult and ultimately impossible, just like it was for the Dutch, who couldn't really keep trade exclusively in the hands of the West India Company. In the 1660s, two coureurs de bois in the far northwest learned from some Indians that there was a great frozen sea somewhere to the north. Probably this was referring to what we call Hudson's Bay. And these coureurs thought that they could use this bay as a channel to traffic pelts by sea directly back to Europe, and hence avoid a lot of the danger and risk and cost of transporting all of these cargoes hundreds of miles across land. And they went to the French government and tried to get them interested in exploring and setting up posts on this inland sea. But they were rebuffed, as is to be expected. They were seen by the French state as simply illegal smugglers. And so naturally they decided to jump ship to the English. They traveled to Boston and made their pitch to colonial officials there, and then were sent on to England, where they even got an audience with King Charles II. And after this point, the English then again leapfrog past the French and seize the initiative in controlling the trade. So in 1670, the English crown chartered the Hudson's Bay Company, which then set up large trading stations or so-called factories on the coast of Hudson's Bay. The largest one, York Factory, was set up on what is now the coast of Manitoba in 1684. The French saw this as an encroachment into their turf, and it led to years of disputed claims and contention between England and France over control of the shore of Hudson Bay and over control of the fur trade. And this particular question was not settled until 1713, with the Treaty of Utrecht at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. And in that treaty, France finally ceded to England all of its claims upon the Hudson Bay Basin, which the English called Rupert's Land, and also they ceded control of all of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which had been divided and disputed between the English and the French. So after this point, Hudson Bay became the main focal point and destination for the traffic in furs in all of Western North America. Thousands of Indians traveled by foot and on canoes through forests, rivers, and lakes northeastward to the shores of Hudson Bay. And the main outpost on the bay, the York Factory, moved as many as 40,000 pelts a year in the early 1700s. But the French did not simply sit back and give up control of the trade. After 1713, the French adventurer Pierre Gaultier de Varennes set out to the northwest, basically from the French outposts on Lake Superior, northwestward into the western interior of what's now Canada. And he created a chain of outposts called Les Postes du Nord on inland waterways, including on Lake Winnipeg, the really big body of water between the interior and the Rocky Mountains and Hudson's Bay. And with these Postes du Nord, the French could then intercept the traffic that was moving from southwest to northeast towards Hudson Bay, and they could buy pelts from the Indians who were on their way to Hudson's Bay, thus relieving them of their cargo before they had to travel hundreds of miles further to the north. And in 1735, just in that year alone, it seems 100,000 pelts were ultimately sent eastward to Montreal. And this was probably the height of the fur trade, all in all, between the 1730s and the 1750s, when you had this intense competition between the French on the Great Lakes and in the interior and the English on Hudson's Bay. And this traffic was only finally disrupted by the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. And after that point, control of the traffic was disputed and changed hands multiple times. So, due to the 7 Years' War, which was in large part a fight over control of the fur trade, that was why the French wanted to maintain their control on these nodes through the interior of North America, the strongholds on the Great Lakes, at Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, Michilimackinac, and the others to the west, these were ceded from France to Great Britain. But nonetheless, even as all of Canada came under British control, still the Northwest Company, an old French fur trading company based in Montreal, continued to operate and continued to compete with the Hudson's Bay Company. And this competition only escalated to the point that in the 1810s, it began to lead to violent skirmishes and almost sparked an open civil war within Canada until the British government intervened and forced the Northwest Company to merge into the Hudson's Bay Company. So effectively now the British had a single monopolistic fur trading company, as these other empires like the Dutch and the French had before. Also in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War, the U.S. was established as an independent state with sovereignty over all territory east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes. And so in this way, the Great Lakes strongholds, those old French forts at Niagara, Detroit, and Michilimackinac, passed to the USA. So now the United States became a new major player in the trade, although the English did continue to hold on to Hudson's Bay and the rest of Canada. So now the United States and the British competed, especially in the far west, as traders ventured further and further deeper into the western part of the continent in pursuit of more furs. And this led to more territorial contestation, especially over the Oregon country in the far northwest. And this dispute was not finally resolved until the 1840s, by which time the trade was now finally fading out due to depletion of the beavers and also due now to changes in fashion, from felt hats towards silk hats. And arguably this is what narrowly saved the North American beavers from total extinction, the fact that this demand finally declined. But nonetheless, the Hudson's Bay Company kept going, and only slowly, over the course of the 19th century, transitioned from trafficking furs to running retail stores. And that's what they still do. So now, what about this specific hat that I brought up, that this lecture is supposedly about? Well, as mentioned earlier, this hat was donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1938 by Lady Spickernell, and I have not been able to find specifically who she is. I assume she was a real person, but I couldn't find anything about her. But according to the museum records, this hat came into the museum collection from Lady Spickernell, along with, quote, a collection of 17th century hats and menswear, which came from her mother's side of the family, the Cottons of Etwall Hall in Derbyshire. So, Etwall Hall was a grand country house in the wealthy village of Etwall, just west of Derby. and this grand estate house was begun in 1495 and gradually expanded and renovated through the years until it was finally demolished in the 1950s. And over the course of those more than 400 years, it passed through the hands of various wealthy English families. And specifically, it came into the Cotton family after 1695, when the heiress of the estate, named Mary Slay, married a wealthy magnate from Shropshire named Rowland Cotton. And after Mary's parents died in the early 1700s, the estate passed to her and to Rowland, and then on to their descendants. And the Cotton family owned and sometimes resided at Etwall Hall until they sold it in the 1920s. So, this is evidently the Cotton family that Lady Spickernell is referring to. But, according to the museum curators, this hat is estimated to date from before 1670. In other words, from before the Cotton family resided at Etwall in Derbyshire. So, as mentioned, this family was originally from Shropshire, and the Rowland Cotton who inherited Etwall Hall had actually grown up at a Cotton family estate called Bellaport in a remote part of Shropshire near the Welsh border. And the family at that time was rich and powerful, with properties and influence all across Shropshire and Staffordshire in the West Midlands through the 1600s. So the hats in the museum collection, and there are at least 2 other hats donated by Lady Spickernell, the hats in the V&A Museum collection very likely belonged to the prominent men of the Cotton family in this period, when they were seated in Shropshire and Staffordshire. And these items reflect their high status and elevated taste, especially in apparel. And in fact, the V&A Museum also owns a very rare set of men's clothing, a silk jacket or doublet and pair of trunk hose or puffed trousers in matching fine white and blue silk, which definitely belonged to another earlier Rowland Cotton. We'll call him Sir Rowland Cotton, who it seems was a forebear, apparently a great uncle, of the later Rowland Cotton who obtained Etwall Hall in Derbyshire. So this elder Rowland Cotton grew up, it seems, in London in the late 1500s in the house of his father, who was a wealthy draper or cloth merchant, and probably hence his close knowledge of clothing and fashion. He was wealthy and known for high taste. He was a friend of Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and acted in court masques. When he came of age, he inherited family estates from his father and his uncles, ranging across the West Midlands. He also was trained in law and was appointed as High Sheriff of Shropshire, and then later was also repeatedly elected to the House of Commons, representing boroughs in Shropshire and Staffordshire, right up until the Parliament was closed down by King Charles I in 1629. As I mentioned, he was known for high and showy taste, and he had the tomb for himself and his wife designed by none other than Inigo Jones. The set of clothing in the V&A collection we know belonged to him and can certainly be dated to no later than 1618, because there is a surviving portrait of Sir Rowland, now in the private collection of the Weiss Gallery in London, which shows him wearing this doublet and hose in bright blue and white silk with gold trim, along with a ruff collar and a velvet cape. And at his side, in his right hand, he is holding a matching tall sugarloaf-shaped beaver fur hat in matching blue with a gold hatband. Now, as far as I can see, that hat that appears in the portrait from 1618 does not survive. But it is reasonable to suppose that the black hat that does reside in the V&A may also have been in his collection, and perhaps was intended for less formal occasions, such as riding or hunting. Sir Rowland died in 1634 without children, and hence it is very plausible that the clothing and hats in his collection may have then passed to a nephew or other male relation, and eventually to the Cotton family in Derbyshire, before then it was later donated to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where it is housed today. So the hat in this way is a product of an immense trade involving trapping, hunting, commerce, warfare, diplomacy, ranging over much of the globe, all the way from North America to Russia. It's reasonable to suppose, considering the time period that this hat comes from, that the pelts very likely came from North America, most likely through Dutch channels from the Hudson Valley to England or the Netherlands, where pelts were made into felt and into this hat, which then was worn by a wealthy gentleman and member of parliament in the 1600s, and then was kept as probably a curiosity and heirloom for some time after, before ending up in the museum collection. So thank you so much for listening. And finally, since it is April and I'm not sure exactly how many more posts I'll be able to make this month or of what kind, at this time I will thank all of my current active patrons who originally signed up in the month of May. And those are Ellen Siskind, Ken Muller, Douglas Horgan, Judy Siskind, Michael Sokolovsky, Siyuan Soon, Megan Haney, Lachlan Paff, Firale Baez, Marcus Puskar, Alice Olson, Robert Hyman, Ben Fishman, Isabella Granich, Diane, Emet Aviatar, Doyle B. Pitchford, Christopher, Anthea Nickerson, another Christopher, and Luke K. Thank you.